Pick up a pencil, go ahead. Wherever you are right now, there is almost certainly a pencil within arm's reach. It might be on your desk, rolling around at the bottom of a drawer, stuck in a mug next to a few dried out markers, or probably you haven't even thought about it in weeks because it's so common and without consequences. But here is a thing. The pencil you're holding was for about 2 centuries, one of the most heavily guarded objects on Earth. Men went to prison for touching one without permission. Governments went to war over the stuff inside it. A French army officer received an emergency commission to reinvent it from scratch, because without it, Napoleon's campaigns risked grinding to a halt. It was never merely about drawing, nor was it ever about writing a simple grocery list. For most of the pencil's early life, the thing inside it, that grey-black core you've always called lead, was a military resource. It was a strategic asset, a weapon technology, an important resource countries hoard and other countries ran secret operations to steal. And nobody taught you any of that. So let's fix that. The story starts with a storm. Sometime around 1564, a fierce storm tore through the Borrowdale Valley in Cumberland, England. Wind ripped a large ash tree clean out of the ground. Shepherds who came to survey the damage found the roots had dragged up a seam of something strange, a soft, dark, almost greasy mineral that left a black mark on whatever it touched. They had no idea what it was. The science of chemistry was barely a science yet. The best guess at the time was that it was some form of lead ore. They called it wad, or plumbago, Latin for "it behaves like lead." That name stuck so hard that we still call the pencil's core lead today, even though there has never been a single atom of lead inside a pencil, not once. The shepherds found it useful almost immediately. They tested marking their sheep with it. Nobody suspected they were standing on the only deposit of its kind ever found in the world. The Borrowdale graphite being the correct name from the Greek word meaning to write, was of almost impossibly pure quality. Pure enough to be sawn into solid sticks, stable enough to hold a shape, dense enough to leave a crisp dark line. Similar deposits of graphite existed elsewhere in Europe, but none came close to this quality. For nearly 3 centuries, Borrowdale was the only place on Earth that could supply it at that grade. And once the wider world figured that out, things got complicated fast. Within a few decades, the graphite was being dug out in controlled amounts and shipped across Europe. Demand for it was on the rise, artists wanted it, scientists wanted it, and critically the military wanted it. Cannonballs cast in graphite-lined moulds came out rounder, smoother, and travelled farther and straighter than balls cast any other way. That one detail changed the military math. England now sat on a substance that gave its navy a measurable edge in artillery, and it knew it. The mines came under armed guard. Workers were strip-searched at the end of every shift to make sure they weren't walking out with wad stuffed in their boots. Mining was restricted to specific windows, sometimes just a few weeks per year, to control supply. The price of high-quality graphite went from £18 per tonne in 1646 to nearly £4,000 per tonne by 1804. Thieves became local legends. After an armed raid on the mine in 1752, Parliament passed a specific law making unlawful entry into a graphite mine a criminal offence, punishable by up to 7 years' transportation to Australia. 7 years in a penal colony for stealing pencil material. Meanwhile, outside England, the rest of Europe was scrambling. The graphite they had access to was inferior, too impure, too crumbly, too grimy. German pencil makers mixed it with sulphur and other binders, but the results were notoriously brittle and inconsistent. Flemish merchants sold raw wad sticks wrapped in string across the continent. The demand kept growing. The supply stayed locked behind armed men in a remote English valley. That situation could not remain same for long. In order to fully grasp what the pencil actually changed, let's picture how writing worked before it. Before the pencil, humans' writing options were limited to a combination of a quill pen prepared from a bird's primary feather, a small pot of ink, and a relatively stable surface. A completely still hand. That setup is far more inconvenient than modern people assume. Quills dulled quickly. A scribe might need to stop and recut the nib every few minutes during heavy writing. Ink had to be carried separately and kept from spilling, freezing, or evaporating. The whole apparatus demanded a table, controlled conditions, and a level of preparation that ruled out casual use. You did not just randomly jot something down, you are prepared to write. Outdoors, in field conditions, anything involving movement made ink impractical. Surgeons couldn't make notes mid-procedure. Architects couldn't sketch on a construction site. A naturalist walking through a forest couldn't stop and document what he found without setting up a portable writing station. The field notebook as we know it today, that casual, anywhere, anytime act of writing down what you observe, simply did not exist. Writing also dried permanently because ink was permanent. Every mistake you made stayed on the page, for drafting, composing, revising, for the kind of thinking on paper that eventually produced scientific papers, constitutional drafts, architectural plans, and literary manuscripts. You were working under constant pressure to get it right the first time, or to start the sheet over. There was a reason literacy remained largely confined to clergymen, scribes, and the wealthy in the 17th century. Writing required materials that cost money, coupled with the technique that required training. What changed with graphite was not just convenience. What changed was access. Graphite sticks didn't spill, they didn't freeze, they didn't require a pot, a preparation ritual, or a still table. You could wrap one in string, stick it in your pocket, and use it on a hillside in the rain. You could draw a line, decide you were wrong, and erase it. Breadcrumbs worked as erasers in the early days, later replaced by rubber. That erasability might sound like a small thing, but it wasn't. The ability to make a mistake and remove it, to draft and revise, to sketch and reconsider, is foundational to every form of creative and analytical thought. Correction is how thinking works. Ink forced thought into final form before it was ready. Graphite let thought stay drafty, experimental, revisable, for as long as you needed it to. The problem was that access to all of this was still locked inside one valley in England, protected by armed guards and an Act of Parliament, until someone broke that lock. His name was Nicolas Jacques Conté, and by 1794 he was working for the French Republic in one of history's more bizarre job titles, Chief of the Balloon Corps. Yes, France had an aerial reconnaissance program during the Revolutionary Wars. Conté ran it. He was one of those rare individuals who moves between disciplines the way most people walk between rooms. He was a painter, balloonist, chemist, and military officer. Napoleon later described him as a universal man with taste, understanding, and genius capable of creating the arts of France in the middle of the Arabian desert. While still at sea, he was interested in the newly developing science of aeronautics. He made at least one hot air balloon, which he flew in the public square. But in 1794, France had a problem that no balloon could solve. Britain's naval blockade had cut off all imports of pure English graphite. French pencil stocks were running out. The inferior German substitute was available in theory, but quality was low and supply unreliable. France needed pencils not just for artists and students. Military officers needed them for maps, siege plans, and field communications. The Committee of Public Safety, the body effectively running France at that moment, commissioned a solution. It fell to Lazare Carnot, Napoleon's future Minister of War, to find someone capable of solving it, and Lazare Carnot chose Conté. Conté's insight was elegant. Instead of searching for purer graphite, which didn't exist, he figured out how to make impure graphite work. He ground it into a fine powder, mixed it with clay, formed the mixture into thin rods, and fired them in a kiln. The heat fused the composite into a consistent material that held a shape, held a point, and left a clean line. By adjusting the ratio of graphite to clay, he could produce rods of different hardness. Softer with more graphite, darker and easier to mark, harder with more clay, lighter and more precise. The full range of pencil grades we use today, those H and B numbers, trace directly back to Conté's ratios. He received a patent in 1795, established a factory, and began supplying the French military. And in doing so, he accidentally did something far larger than solve a wartime logistics problem. He broke England's monopoly permanently. Before Conté, the pencil's quality was bounded by the geology of one valley in Cumberland. You could have a good pencil or you could manage without one, and the difference depended on whether you had access to Borrowdale graphite. After Conté, any country with clay and even mediocre graphite could manufacture a quality pencil. The technique was reproducible with the materials everywhere. The formula was out in the world. Germany, Nuremberg, which had been making inferior graphite pencils for decades, rebuilt its entire industry around the Conté process. By the mid-19th century, German pencil manufacturers were among the best in the world. American factories immediately followed. Henry David Thoreau, the same man who wrote Walden and spent 2 years in a cabin thinking about civil disobedience, spent years of his life perfecting pencil production at his family's Massachusetts factory, eventually developing a grading system numbered 1 through 4 that became the ancestor of the number 2 pencils every American student has used on a standardized test. The price of pencils dropped and kept dropping until a pencil was essentially free, and at that point, something happened to literacy. When writing required quills and ink and training, literacy clustered at the top of society. When pencils became cheap enough to hand to a child in a classroom, when making a mistake meant simply erasing it instead of starting over on expensive paper, the entire economics of learning to write shifted. Schools could equip students in bulk. Children who had never had access to writing materials could practice on any surface with any pencil. By the late 19th century, pencils had become standard classroom equipment across the industrialized world, and literacy rates were climbing in ways that would have been hard to imagine a century before. Writing, recording thought, transmitting it across time and distance, the thing that distinguishes literate civilization from everything before it, was gate-kept for centuries by the cost and fragility of writing tools. The pencil, of all things, forced that gate open. It was never about drawing, it was about who got to think on paper, and for most of history the answer was, not you. The Borrowdale mine closed in 1891. By then it was uneconomical. The world no longer needed perfectly pure graphite for pencils. Conte's process had made purity optional. The mine that had once required armed guards and an Act of Parliament to protect, that had given the English Navy a measurable military edge, shut down quietly because nobody needed it anymore. Today there are roughly 15 billion pencils manufactured every year. The United States alone uses around 2.8 billion annually. The average pencil can draw a line 35 miles long or write roughly 45,000 words before it's gone. The pencil is so cheap that we lose them without noticing. They disappear into couch cushions and car seats and the bottoms of backpacks, and we don't go looking for them because there are always more. The thing that was once subject to armed guards and felony prosecution and national emergency commissions now lives in cups on desks and gets chewed on during phone calls. The history nobody taught you ends here, in your hand. A storm knocked over a tree. Shepherds found something strange. England locked it away. An army officer in revolutionary France cracked the lock open in a matter of days. Millions of people who had never been permitted to write picked up cheap pencils and learned how. Next time you lose one under the couch and don't bother to find it, remember what it cost to get there.